Well, it's great to see so many friends here. People have traveled a long way. Really quite impressive. Quite a number from Sonoma and Napa, one from Reno, Nevada. There's members of my cycling group, which is known as Team Tortoise. We may be slow, but we get there in the end. And also from our Rockzilla Napa rock climbing group that has the affectionate name Belays and Beers, which needs no explanation. You know, what we've missed so much during the pandemic is this ability to get together as a group. Another friend of mine who's here, who's a winemaker and philosopher, Daniel Barron, said to me, if you look at human history, the one behavior that's been constant is our desire and love to get together in groups and tell stories. Not just parents and children, but adults together and pass information. And it's a special human experience, so I'd like to thank all of you for being here to share that experience together. And I hope you enjoy it, because this has been one of the more difficult presentations I've ever written. Now, decisions are difficult in war. When it comes to military engagement, it's always carried out in the context of political decision-making. Historically, rules and agreements have always applied about who can kill who, how and when people can be killed, and how prisoners should be treated, whether that is the Samurai Code, chivalry, the Geneva Convention, or rules of engagement. Such rules may well vary according to the nature of the conflict, the most complex being when you're fighting your own citizens in your own country. This complexity is increased when different rules apply to different organizations, the army, intelligence, police, and others. And it's multiplied further when they're changing throughout the conflict. For 30 years, British security forces struggled with this conundrum. How they did so, and eventually, after many mistakes, defeat the IRA, who were seeking to take Northern Ireland out of the UK against the will of the majority of people who lived there, is the heart of this presentation. In 1968, I was commissioned from the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst with my friend John Moss, and he's the one on the left-hand side of the picture. He contributed significantly to this presentation, and he was involved in intelligence operations throughout the whole of the 1970s in Northern Ireland. At that time, we didn't have the slightest clue that within a few years, we'd both be on the streets of our own country fighting an insurgency that would kill over 3,700 people. Now, it might have been described as a civil war, an insurrection, a rebellion against the state, but it would end up, in true British understatement, as the Troubles. Northern Ireland at this time had a population of roughly 1.5 million people. Now, to get this in context, because there's a tendency, when we think about America and the size of America, and we talk about casualties, and we think about it in context with that number of people. Northern Ireland has roughly the same number of people as California's Sacramento County. So when I go through this and I talk about casualties, and I'll build them up as we go through, just think about all of that happening in Sacramento County, California. The name of the British Armed Forces operation, and this included Army, Navy, and Air Force in Northern Ireland from 1969 to 2007, was Operation Banner. Over 300,000 service personnel would serve in Operation Banner. It became the longest continuous deployment in British military history. Now, it's the role of the civilian government to lay down the mission and parameters for the execution of that mission for their security forces. The security forces are then accountable for working out how they can achieve that mission within those parameters. The UK government activated the British Army in support of the Northern Irish Police, or Royal Ulster Constabulary, the RUC, and I'll be referring to them from now on as the RUC. The British government, for understandable political reasons, regarded this as a criminal enterprise. There certainly were many criminal elements about it. That's always the case when law and order breaks down. But in reality, it was an armed insurrection to tear Northern Ireland away from the United Kingdom. So what does it mean to be a citizen of the UK or to be Irish? Here's a slide of my own DNA profile. I would suggest this is pretty typical of people who live on these islands. The Norwegian and Icelandic bit comes from Vikings and Normans, who were descendants of Vikings. And as you can see, I have English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish blood running through my veins. In other words, the people of these islands have enjoyed, as well as killed each other, over a very long period of time. Now, the main difference is religion, which is predominantly Christian, but Protestants and Roman Catholics have been at each other's throats for many hundreds of years on either side of the Irish Sea. In 1921, after the Government of Ireland Act of 1920, 4/5 of Ireland achieved its independence from the rest of the UK. At that same time, Northern Ireland, that's the 6 counties in grey on the map, was created. The Irish Republican Army, or IRA, opposed the act, refusing to recognise either government in the north or south of Ireland. An IRA uprising against the act was defeated by Irish Free State forces in 1923. In 1962, another IRA insurgency broke out. The UK and the Southern Irish governments worked together, introducing internment without trial on each side of the border, defeating the second IRA insurgency. Northern Ireland was a country defined by sectarian division and paranoia. The Unionists, or Loyalists, mainly Protestant, who wished to stay part of the United Kingdom, had a built-in majority. But the growing Catholic or nationalist or Republican population, they wanted to stay. Discrimination against Catholics in terms of housing, jobs, and politics was rife. Gerrymandering, something we know a great deal about ourselves in the US and are unable to end ourselves, was normal. For example, in the city of Londonderry, if you're Unionist, or Derry if you're Catholic, 9,000 Unionist votes created 12 members of the city council, whereas 14,000 nationalist votes created only 8 city council members. The Northern Ireland Civil Rights Organization was modeled on the US Civil Rights Organization. It was intended to be peaceful. In the late 1960s, there was little support for violence. This had failed in the past. The Unionists, on the other hand, didn't want any change to their position of hegemony. They were paranoid, not without reason, about Irish nationalism, which they saw as a takeover by the Roman Catholic Church. At that time, the Roman Catholic Church had a special position in the Constitution of Ireland, which was later deleted in the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution in 1973. The voice of resistance to any change in the status of Unionists was the religious leader Ian Paisley. Peaceful protests were met with violence from the RUC and Protestant mobs. Only a few hundred met for the first march in Derry. After it was violently suppressed, thousands turned up for the next one. A lesson to be learned here is that if peaceful demonstrations are dealt with violently, they will turn violent. Unionists believed the civil rights organization was a front for the IRA and a united Ireland. In reality, it was there for equal rights for all Northern Irish citizens. The way the protesters were treated destroyed the dream of peaceful change. Anyone hurt by the RUC or Protestants' gangs was a potential recruit for the IRA. Protestants turned on their Catholic neighbors. In August 1969, the three-day Battle of the Bogside took place in Derry with local Unionists and the RUC on one side and Catholic residents of the Bogside on the other. The RUC were unable to enter the area or protect Catholic homes. Widespread violence erupted throughout Northern Ireland. Guns came out, 4 were shot dead, including a 9-year-old boy. The British Army was called in to restore order. Deploying an unprepared British Army in support of the police in the UK brought its own difficulties, not least in command and control. John and I learned the principles of counterinsurgency at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. They were sound then as they are now. You need a coordinated political, military, and civil response with one person over all elements. In the 1970s, there was no one person in overall charge. In the UK, the uniformed armed forces report through the Ministry of Defence. MI5, the Internal Secret Intelligence Service, like their equivalent in the FBI, operate under the statutory authority of the Home Office, but they're not part of the Home Office. MI6, or SIS, who carry out CIA-type overseas intelligence operations, report to the Foreign Secretary. Membership of the RUC meant you were in the most dangerous police force in the world. The RUC, not the British Army, bore the brunt of the troubles. They reported to the government of Northern Ireland at Stormont Castle. When Stormont was prorogued or suspended, they reported directly to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. All of these different agencies were meant to work together. With no one in overall charge, this was extremely difficult. John and I have chosen to call the first phase of this campaign as the General's War. In a vacuum of leadership, senior British Army officers took over. They had experience of campaigns against insurgencies in Malaya, Kenya, Oman, Cyprus, and Aden. The reality was, this experience was not helpful. They had no idea how to deal with protesters on the streets of their own country, with the world watching through television, and they didn't respect the knowledge, experience, and skills of the RUC. As an example, John and I remember being trained on crowd dispersal techniques at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst barely 2 years before the British Army deployed on the streets of Northern Ireland. We found ourselves in a classic British Army square with rifles. We would unfurl a huge banner with the words "disperse or we fire" written in the local language and in English. Then when no one dispersed, someone would shout, "Rifleman number 3, man with the red shirt, fire." We were somewhat shocked at this technique. Not only did it appear to be a great way to boost recruitment for any insurgents, but also, if we were ever in a demonstration ourselves, we must remember never to wear a red shirt. Senior British Army officers knew little of civil affairs. To be fair, this was a quagmire anyway. Protestant church leaders would not support any change that gave Catholics a better life, and Catholic church leaders insisted on continuing the segregation of their children in exclusively Catholic schools. They had almost total control over the everyday lives of their parishioners, and some were active members of the IRA. The end result was any Hearts and Mind program was dead at birth. In March 1971, the IRA went on the offensive, killing 3 off-duty soldiers. 2 were only 17 years of age. The British Army stopped sending 17-year-old soldiers to Northern Ireland. In August 1971, the Stormont government, with the approval from the UK government in Westminster and support from senior army officers, ordered internment without trial. They did this without support from the Southern Irish government and with poor intelligence swooping up hundreds of people, many of whom had no involvement with the IRA. This was another recruiting success for the IRA. It was also another propaganda weapon in gaining even more support from Irish Americans who were supplying money and guns through NORAID, the Irish Northern Aid Committee, formed in 1969. The financial support of Irish Americans for the IRA is central to the story of the Northern Irish insurgency. 1972 was the year the IRA would come close to defeating the British security forces, including the British Army in Northern Ireland. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to refer to the Provisional IRA who broke away from the official IRA in the early 1970s and the INLA who split from the Provisional IRA in the late 1970s as the IRA. In January 1972, the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, known as 1 Para, and one of the 3 resident battalions who were stationed in Northern Ireland with their families for 2 years. 4 years earlier, 1 Para had been in Aden, now part of Yemen. Senior officers used them as shock troops to put down peaceful demonstrations. 1 Para was sent to the city of Londonderry or Derry to enforce the ban on a civil rights march. Encouraged by senior officers to be tough, they shot 13 civilians. This event is now enshrined in mythology as Bloody Sunday. It was a disaster for everyone except the IRA, who were overwhelmed with volunteers. A month later, the IRA would car bomb Aldershot in England, the home of the Parachute Regiment, ineptly, killing a Roman Catholic priest, a civilian gardener, and 5 female cleaners. No military personnel were touched. The IRA launched a continuous bombing campaign and created no-go areas for security forces in Catholic nationalist Republican strongholds where the British Army would not go. But the IRA was not winning any hearts and minds outside of the nationalist community and their main supporters, Irish Americans on the northeast and west coast of the US. It was rare to go even one day without the well-known announcement on the radio or TV, and today another soldier was killed on the streets of Northern Ireland. The IRA was claiming victory. Their actions resulted in the Northern Irish government of Stormont being suspended. The IRA was training active service units, ASUs, in the Irish Republic to the south and in no-go areas under their control. In what they called Free Derry, they had their own leader, Martin McGuinness. Gerry Adams, a member of the IRA's Army Council, was also leading the political wing of the IRA, Sinn Féin. Morale was high, surely. Victory was just another bomb away. The IRA's optimism for their impending victory was not without reason. In June 1972, Prime Minister Edward Heath's British government was in talks with the IRA. Gerry Adams was released from internment to represent the IRA. Terms for a ceasefire were agreed, paving way for further talks in London. The London talks started on July 7, 1972. Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness were there. The IRA were confident and defiant, demanding a British commitment to withdrawal. What they didn't know at the time was this would be the closest they would ever come to victory. The talks went nowhere. Worse, with news of the talks leaking out and suspension of the Northern Irish government, close to 1 million Protestants were in revolt. 1972 would end up the bloodiest year of the conflict, with over 500 deaths, and the IRA responsible for most of them. Over 20,000 Protestants joined the Loyalist paramilitary forces, the Ulster Defence Association, UDA, and the Ulster Volunteer Force, UVF, unleashing random attacks on Catholics. Army intelligence within British Army line units, that's uniformed troops on the ground, with few notable exceptions, achieved little. British Army battalions were rotating every 4 months, led by commanders who believed they knew what they were doing and keen to make a mark and earn a medal. They often muddied or disrupted valuable long-term intelligence operations run by the RUC Special Branch, which required skill and patience. At the same time, the British Armed Forces began to plan the largest British military operation since the Suez Crisis in the mid-1950s. This was Operation Motorman. This, at last, was something they could do well. With the talks going on between the IRA and the British government, the British Army needed an excuse to launch an operation to take back the no-go areas. After the breakdown of the talks and the breakdown of the ceasefire on July 21, 1972, the IRA gave the British Army the excuse it needed. In the space of 75 minutes, 22 bombs were detonated in Belfast. 9 people, including 2 British soldiers, were killed, 130 were injured. For the IRA, this was the mass bombing that was going to drive out the Brits. It achieved the opposite. In the very early hours of July 31, 1972, 28,000 troops, including 27 infantry and 2 armored battalions, including over 5,000 local UDR, that's the Ulster Defence Regiment troops led by Royal Engineer Centurion tanks, with their demolition guns facing rear, smashed through the barriers and troops poured into the no-go areas. The IRA lost the ground it had taken, it would never be recovered. 1973 was the first year I deployed to Northern Ireland in the infantry role. The training we had received prior to deploying had greatly improved from the early days. The British Army had built an Irish town on the training grounds of Sennelager, Germany. Everything we did was filmed and debriefed. We learned how to talk to the press, how to arrest someone using Aikido, which controls them in a non-life-threatening way and doesn't look bad on television. It was all good, and I felt well prepared, not least after reading multiple books on the history of Ireland. As you can see from this film, which I took myself, the Army tried, but it was difficult to prepare soldiers for the psychological impact of picking up bits of shattered baby after it and its mother had been blown through a chain-link fence by an IRA bomb. 1973 was also the year of the Sunningdale Agreement between Edward Heath's British government and the Irish Taoiseach Liam Cosgrave. However, Edward Heath would shortly lose his position as Prime Minister following the election, and Harold Wilson became Prime Minister, leading a minority government. The Sunningdale Agreement was an attempt to create a power-sharing executive in Northern Ireland, including a cross-border council involving the Irish government. It was the right political move, and frankly, little different to the Good Friday Accord that ended the conflict many years later. But it was the wrong time. It would backfire badly. The IRA had not yet been defeated. It was opposed by Ian Paisley and all the Unionist Protestants who came up with the famous cry, "No surrender." Unionists launched a general strike against the agreement along with UVF attacks within the Irish Republic, killing 33 civilians. By May 1974, the Sunningdale administration had collapsed. The Unionists had tested and smashed Prime Minister Harold Wilson's British government's resolve. The IRA took lessons from this. If the Unionists could break the British government's resolve, then so could they. In one operation I was involved in, I'm the one in the middle of that picture with the officer's cap badge. In one operation I was involved in, we'd been informed that an IRA assassin had targeted a specific house to kill a woman who lived there. It was claimed the IRA believed she was a suspect informer, which she was not. We were laid up in the attic of a bombed-out house across the street, watching the target house across the road. You have to lie completely still for hours and sometimes days. If you're discovered, you could end up the ones being ambushed. So there's a real incentive for silence, as well as knowing how to urinate into a bottle quietly while laying down. It was about 2 in the morning, and we saw a man approach the house. He rang the doorbell. One of my soldiers whispered, "Can we kill him now, sir?" This was not an unreasonable request, given our stated mission to protect the woman and kill the assassin. But to me, there was something wrong with the picture. So I said no, to the great disappointment of the other 2 soldiers. I said, "We're going to arrest him." We jumped down from the attic, sprinted across the road, and arrested the man. He had nothing to do with the IRA. He was drunk. He knew the woman was single and on her own, and he wanted some company. The intelligence we'd been working on was wrong, overhyped through bad process, and nearly resulted in the death of an innocent man, and possibly the 3 of us had we been discovered. After months on the street as an infantry officer, I spent some time in civilian clothes on the intelligence side. It was one of the most difficult times of my life. Different intelligence units were stealing information from each other and were completely out of control. The only people who knew what they were doing were the RUC Special Branch. It was close to impossible for the British Army or RUC to deal with the IRA under criminal law because they would never achieve a conviction in court. Suspects would say nothing. The RUC could not reveal their sources, and any jury would be too terrified to convict. The British government recognized the situation, and they passed the Northern Ireland Emergency Provisions Act in 1973, which allowed non-jury trials for terrorist cases. This was known as the Diplock Courts. It was a small step forward. MI6 was working with the FBI here in the US, but failing to shut down the flow of guns, explosives, and money from NORAID, set up as a front to raise money for Irish prisoners. In reality, it was buying weapons, ammunition, and explosives. IRA key money raisers and procurers of weapons, explosives, and bomb timers were a Catholic priest named Patrick Ryan, Brendan Hughes, and Joe Carhill. During my time in Northern Ireland in 1973 and 1974, all the IRA weapons my unit discovered could be traced back to the US. Years later, with the help of MI6, the FBI infiltrated NORAD. They broke up a gun-running operation from the inside, seizing huge amounts of weapons and cash, with 5 members, all New York citizens, arrested. The New York trial here in the US became a political farce. The defense proudly admitted all the offenses and more. They claimed they were justified in taking up arms to overthrow the British. And with trial watchers and even the clerk of the court chanting IRA, IRA, and up the provost, all the defendants were acquitted. This simply proved to the British intelligence services that this was a war that could not be won in the courts. The attacks launched by the IRA in London and the English mainland in December 1974 were a huge tactical and strategic mistake by the IRA. This photo is from another IRA London bombing. Until that time, few on the mainland bothered much about what was going on in Northern Ireland. The bombings united the British population against the IRA, and worse for the IRA, the Irish government in the Republic was turning against them, perceiving them as a real threat to a democratic Ireland. By December 1974, 1,288 had died. Around this time, we moved to what John and I have called the Major's War. It was the realization that the course charted by the generals was wrong. These junior officers believed the IRA could only be defeated by good intelligence and covert military operations involving specialist units with intelligence from the RUC Special Branch, who would also be in the lead. In other words, return to police primacy, the original intent when the British Army was first deployed. British intelligence operations became more sophisticated and effective. Special intelligence units set up a number of front companies to gather intelligence, the most famous of which was the Foursquare Laundry operation, utilizing both men and women soldiers with Northern Irish accents. The Foursquare pick-up and drop-off laundry was not only a low-cost, super-efficient laundry service, but it featured attractive young women picking up and dropping off personal laundry. It became popular in nationalist areas it served. Prior to laundering the clothes, they were tested for explosive residue. Once the homes were identified, they were raided, along with other houses, or using other ruses, bugged. Significant amount of weapons, ammunition, and explosives were found. This was but one of many creative surveillance operations carried out by British Army specialist intelligence units, along with the RUC Special Branch. But this was dangerous work. In the case of the Foursquare Laundry, the operation was compromised by a double agent inside the IRA. The IRA set up an ambush for the laundry vehicle, which you can see on this slide. They riddled the van with bullets, killing the soldier who was driving. A female soldier, delivering laundry to a house, escaped, sheltered by the homeowner, who had no idea that the pretty young woman with a Northern Irish Coleraine accent was a British soldier. Women soldiers were used extensively in high-risk special operations in Northern Ireland, as well as patrolling on the streets. Because of the secrecy of these activities, they received little recognition. By the way, the informer who gave up the laundry operation was executed by the IRA. By 1975, the British had penetrated the IRA with informers. Many of these informers were committing terrorist acts, that is, murder. There was concern that British intelligence operatives who knew about this could also be charged with complicity to murder. British Army and RUC intelligence teams, along with the Special Air Service, or SES, the British Army's Special Forces, were under the same rules of engagement as the uniformed regular army. IRA active service units, or ASUs, were set out to kill and create mayhem. British intelligence, or SES units, hunting them down with information from the RUC Special Branch, had to assume that these ASUs had weapons or explosives. At night, in civilian clothes, as I've already described, it's almost impossible to see weapons or bombs until the firing starts or the bomb is detonated. By then, of course, it's too late. Civilians, women, children are dead. It was an impossible situation for security forces when success of their operation and saving of life could lead to an investigation and a murder charge. It didn't take the press long to pick up on what appeared to be a difference in rules of engagement for uniformed and non-uniformed soldiers. They began reporting the activities of British intelligence forces as a shoot-to-kill policy. This was denied by the government. To reinforce their stated position, as to reinforce the government's stated position, they started investigations into the British security forces, which were launched in the UK, and these were serious investigative teams led by senior British policemen from the mainland. At the same time, these same politicians were nodding and winking, encouraging the same behavior from the intelligence forces that were being investigated. This was utterly duplicitous. What was needed was a formal change in the rules of engagement. I'm not making any statement about whether these changes would be morally right or not. That's a human judgment. I'm talking about a transparent due process of law. Without this formal and open process, who decides and how can you hold someone accountable for what actions are taken? Intelligence operations are messy. Locals use the situation as an opportunity to get back at those with whom they have a grudge, whether it's by telling the IRA that someone is an informer when they're not, or calling the security forces tip line, telling them that someone's a member of the IRA and has explosives and weapons in their house, which they might even have planted themselves. If you superimpose this unavoidable messiness on lack of due process and accountability, you create a very difficult situation for all involved. In 1977, I was a 29-year-old acting major in the role of operations officer of the city of Belfast. I was not in command, but I was in control of all operations in the city, which at times included multiple infantry battalions, along with helicopters with television cameras sending pictures of what was going on directly back to the operations room. We called that heli-telly. I had the opportunity to join patrols on the street, and I was much happier back in operations rather than in an intelligence role. In 1979, the Army, MI6, MI5, and the RUC Special Branch supported the formation of the TCG, the Tasking Coordination Group, which included my friend John Moss. The TCG was meant to be the central gathering point for all intelligence by the various agencies that were operating in competition against each other. While this greatly increased the effectiveness and lethality of the British intelligence operation, it did not resolve the legal jeopardy everybody found themselves in due to the unwillingness of the Westminster government to change the rules of engagement. In May 1979, Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. She ordered the intelligence services to destroy the IRA. She knew the IRA had to be defeated in the field before any political solution could be proposed. However, she would endorse the policy of criminalization. She didn't want IRA prisoners granted the status of prisoners of war. She would not give in to an IRA hunger strike which collapsed after 10 prisoners died. In short, she did support the junior officers' methods, but would not officially change the rules of engagement to enable them to operate both effectively and legally. During this time, Margaret Thatcher came to Northern Ireland. She walked the streets and talked to the people directly. This was brave and a security nightmare. She understood she needed the support of Protestant Unionists, the Irish Republic, as well as the US government, to shut down the flow of money, guns, and explosives flowing to the IRA from New York and Boston via NORAID. The IRA was rebuilding their US finance and arms network. Here comes the good bit, guys. A key player in this was John Crawley, a US Marine, who left the US Marine Corps to join the IRA. Crawley had little idea of how well the FBI and MI6 had penetrated his organization. He'd be arrested in 1984 on board the trawler Marita Ann. They were off the coast of Derry. The Irish Navy intercepted them, and he was captured with 4 others, along with 7 tons of firearms and explosives on their way from the US. His ship had been tracked by the Royal Air Force, and they sailed right into a trap. The entire IRA organization had been so thoroughly penetrated by the British intelligence that they became paranoid of informers in their midst. IRA active service units were being slaughtered on operation. While the IRA would continue to mount occasional and brutal attacks on civilians, they could no longer operate as a large-scale terrorist force. They had effectively been neutralized in Belfast and Derry. So now we move to the third and final phase of the war, what John and I have called the politicians' war. In 1985, Sinn Féin made gains in local elections, increasing the influence of Gerry Adams. By the time the Anglo-Irish Agreement was signed in November 1985, 2,721 had died. The agreement was a huge success for the moderate politician John Hume. It offered greater security cooperation, including a role for the Irish government in Northern Ireland. Within weeks, the Irish security forces were picking up the IRA's US weapons and explosives in arms dumps in Southern Ireland. American weapons were being seized on the high seas by the French, Irish, and Royal Navy. The Republican movement, taking losses in the field and losing their US-funded weapons stored in the South, was taking a beating. On November the 8th, 1987, the IRA killed 11 civilians, a police officer, and injured 63 at a Remembrance Day service in Enniskillen. This horrific bombing sickened civilians on all sides of both north and south of Ireland. This was a turning point in the war, undermining support for the IRA and Sinn Féin even within Republican areas. It facilitated the passing of the Extradition Act in the Republic, making it easier for the British to extradite IRA suspects from the south to the north. It unleashed further revenge attacks from loyalist gunmen against the families and friends of IRA volunteers in the north, and it spurred new efforts by Gerry Adams towards a political solution rather than a military victory. By November 1987, 2,893 had died. Throughout the 1980s, the British steadily reduced the numbers of Lyme British Army uniformed soldiers in the north, pushing the Ulster Defence Regiment, the UDR, into the front line. Intelligence forces working with the RUC Special Branch remained engaged, taking a steady toll on the IRA. However, the IRA was still able to carry out random attacks, which should not be underestimated. 4 soldiers and 7 horses were killed in a nail bomb attack on a military ceremonies in Hyde Park and Regent's Park, London. Off-duty soldiers in the UK and Germany were assassinated, including one in Germany where the IRA also shot his 6-month-old daughter. Soldiers stopped wearing uniforms off-duty. Military commanders appeared on IRA death lists and were personally targeted, as were politicians, including Margaret Thatcher and her cabinet in the famous bombing of the Grand Hotel in Brighton, England. Lord Mountbatten was assassinated in Ireland when the IRA blew up him and his young relatives in their fishing boat. On that same day, 18 British soldiers were killed in a bombing near the Irish border at Warren Point. Although what I went through could not be compared to what the RUC went through with their families in Northern Ireland, over 20 years living like this, it changed the way you lived. You would not switch on the lights in a room in the evening without drawing the drapes or curtains first. We had fully automatic weapons in the house, and my children, one of whom is in the audience today, Lawrence, my son, had to regularly train with them on the range so they were capable of defending themselves. You would never sit in a restaurant with your back to the door. If a car was left outside, we had mirrors on sticks to check underneath for bombs, a prescient precaution as shown when Lieutenant General Sir Stuart Pringle, Royal Marines, was blown up outside his house in London with a bomb under his car. Erin Neve, a legendary escapee from Colditz Castle, MI9 intelligence operator, World War II Nuremberg trial lawyer, and politician, was blown up and killed in a car bomb attached to his car in the Palace of Westminster car park. In 1990, when still in the Army, I moved to Los Angeles to study for a defense fellowship and teach at the University of Southern California for a year. An American friend asked if I was concerned about living there because of crime in the area. I simply replied, I have never felt so safe in my life. In March 1988, British intelligence services tracked an IRA ASU who were moving to carry out a devastating car bombing in the tiny British territory bordering Spain, Gibraltar. They were planning to bomb the changing of the guard ceremony at the governor's residence. The British deployed the SAS to stop them. This they did, killing the entire ASU and saving many lives. However, instead of congratulating them, yet another inquiry was launched into a shoot-to-kill policy. Despite this, the SAS operation was eventually ruled legal. The IRA volunteers' bodies were returned to Belfast as heroes of the IRA. Throughout the 1990s, yet more inquiries were launched by the British government into British intelligence forces. The three Stevens inquiries created great difficulties for the intelligence organization, not least for the protection of their sources. They revealed the huge scale of the British intelligence operations, along with close coordination between MI6, MI5, the Army Special Intelligence Units, and the RUC Special Branch. The only organization protecting the intelligence services was MI5, who raided the buildings of the inquiries, seizing hard drives which were wiped, cleaned, and returned. By June 1997, 3,564 had died. In 1998, a final agreement was made between the British and Irish governments and 8 political parties or groupings from Northern Ireland. Appropriately, because the IRA was sustained and supplied from the US Senator George Mitchell was sent to chair the talks between the parties and groups by the US President Bill Clinton. The so-called Good Friday Accord was approved by voters across the island of Ireland in 2 referendums held on May 22, 1988. Ian Paisley's Democratic Unionist Party was the only major political group to oppose the agreement. The agreement acknowledged the majority of people of Northern Ireland wished to remain part of the United Kingdom, that a substantial section of the people of Northern Ireland and the majority of people on the island of Ireland wished to bring about a united Ireland. Both of these views were acknowledged as being legitimate. If a majority of people of both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland wished and voted otherwise, the British and Irish governments are under a binding obligation to implement that choice. The IRA were given amnesty. Bombers and assassins were released from jail, but security forces were not. Martin McGuinness, who John and I hunted for some time, and Jerry Adams, both became respected members of the new government, along with Ian Paisley. However, inquiries go on to this day about the activities of the security forces who defeated the IRA and set the scene for the Good Friday Accord. In May this year, 2021, 2 veterans over 70 years of age were prosecuted for the murder of Joe McCann in the markets area of Belfast in April 1972. The case collapsed and the 2 soldiers were found not guilty. At the time of his death, the IRA boasted that Joe McCann was responsible for the murders of 15 British soldiers. The Historical Inquiries Team, HET, has been investigating this and continues to pursue other cases against British soldiers while those fighting with the IRA go free. The current Westminster government is talking about changes to this situation, but as I speak right now, they have yet to do so. 1998 was the year the IRA agreed to disarm and give up its weapons. But money was still flowing in from New York and Boston. It was not until 2001, 9/11, when the US came to understand what terrorism really meant, that the FBI was given the political cover to move in and finally shut down the entire money supply and gun supply running operation from the US. A line could at last be drawn under the name the Troubles. Over 3,700 people had died. Approximately 48,000 were injured. Each of those had families, brothers, sisters, children, uncle, and aunts. Thousands more were affected in other ways. The fact that it took John and I 50 years before we could write this presentation tells its own story. Thank you.